Cari amici, dear friends, bentrovati. Welcome back to all of you who follow our programs regularly, and of course a warm welcome goes also to those of you who are joining us today for the first time. I am Emanuela Amendola, the director of the Italian Cultural Institute at the Embassy of Italy in Washington DC. Thank you for being with us. Today, once again, we celebrate the great Dante Alighieri. If you connected with us for our previous webinars, you will know that this year Italy commemorates the 700th anniversary of Dante's death, a remarkable milestone for us considering how crucial Dante is for Italy's cultural identity. For this anniversary, the Embassy of Italy in Washington DC and its consular and cultural network organized more than 60 events that will take place throughout the year and throughout the country. We will have lectures, exhibitions, film screenings, dance performances, and each event will touch upon a different aspect of Dante's poetics and legacy. Besides the Embassy of Italy in Washington DC, I also would like to acknowledge the support of my colleagues directing the other 6 Italian Cultural Institutes in North America, and more specifically Director Fabio Finotti in New York, together with colleague Paolo Barlera, Luca Di Vito at the Italian Cultural Institute in Chicago, Anna Maria Di Giorgio in San Francisco, Valeria Rumori in Los Angeles, Francesco Darelli in Montreal, and Veronica Manson in Toronto. Thank you for co-presenting this program with us. During today's webinar, we will take a closer look to one of the Commedia most famous canti, Inferno 26, and more broadly, Dante's take on one of the most 𝗨𝗆𝗶𝗵𝗵, multi-faced and crossing boundaries figures of Western literature, Ulysses. Ulysses that in the Divine Comedy by Dante becomes an allegory of human intelligence. What can we do with our intelligence? Are we allowed to pursue any intellectual quest regardless of its consequences? These are some of the questions that Dante poses in this canto, and that in a minute we will have the honor and privilege of exploring with Professor Lino Pertile. Lino Pertile is 𝗨𝗶𝗃𝗿𝗀𝗀 Research Professor of Romance Languages and Literatures at Harvard University. He is also a member of the Accademia Ambrosiana in Milan and the Accademia Lincei in Rome. A graduate of the University of Padua, he taught Italian literature in France, in Italy, and in the United Kingdom before joining Harvard University in 1995, where he served as housemaster and director of 𝗨𝗶𝗃𝗿𝗀𝗃, the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies in Florence. Professor Pertile has published essays on French and Italian Renaissance, on the 20th century Italian literature, and especially on 𝗨𝗶𝗊𝗁 and the contemporary novel. Of course, he published many titles on Dante. Amongst his most recent publications are Dante in Context and a book that just came out in Italy and that is titled Dante Popolare, a very interesting read about Dante's success and the different levels at which the Commedia can be read. Before giving the floor to Professor Pertile, I just would like to remind you that we will be taking questions for our speaker at the end of the presentation. You can type your questions or comments at any time in the chat or the Q&A sections of your Zoom client, and we will try to answer to as many as possible. Professor Pertile, sono davvero felice e grato di averla qui con noi oggi per celebrare Dante. Thank you so much for being with us today. The screen is yours.
Buonasera a tutti. Good evening to everyone, and thank you, Emanuele, for your wonderful presentation. It's a privilege and an honor to be in this position, to be both at home and talk to so many people about a subject that I find immensely fascinating, like the personality, the figure of Ulysses in Dante's Divina Commedia. We are going to move in a few seconds into the 8th circle of Dante's Inferno. The 8th circle, as I'm sure you will know, is the biggest, the largest circle of Dante's Inferno. It's in fact, it occupies, or that it takes Dante 13 cantos to go through the 8th circle. And it is itself divided or subdivided into 10 subcircles known as 𝗨𝗏𝗁𝗁. And in these 10 subcircles are housed, as it were, panders and seducers, flatterers, simonists, diviners, barators, hypocrites, thieves, false counselors, schismatics, and sowers of discord. falsifiers divided in metal falsifiers, or person falsifiers, money falsifiers, and words falsifiers. So it is really a world of its own. This is the world of 𝗨𝗶𝗶𝗵𝗶𝗶, a word that translated into English sounds like the evil pouches. We can call them pouches, we can call them ditches. They are a kind of valleys, they are concentric ditches around the center of hell. And there are 10 of them, and we are moving into the eighth 𝗟𝗶𝗶𝗵𝗶, the eighth ditch, where Dante locates the 26th and 27th of the cantos of Inferno. Now, to read these two cantos, we need to start from 6 lines that begins on line 19 of Canto 26. Allor mi dolsi e ora mi ridoglio, Dante writes. Quando drizzo la mente a ciò che io vidi, e più lo ingegno a freno chi non soglio, perché non corra che virtù non il guidi, sicché se stella buona o miglior cosa m'ha dato il ben, ch'io stessi non mi invidi. Dante declares that he grieved then when he saw with his own eyes the 𝗶𝗷𝗃, the eighth 𝗶𝗷𝗃 of the eighth circle of hell. And he grieves again now, how he's about to share his memory of it with the living. The cause of so much grieving will be the subject of this canto and the next. But meanwhile, it is suggested by the following 4 lines. In that 𝗶𝗷𝗃, Dante says, I saw people forever wrapped in fire for failing to keep their intelligence checked by virtue. As a result of this experience, now more than ever, I take care how I use my intelligence, knowing that without the constant guidance of moral values, I too could end up damned forever in hell. 2 points strike me here. First, Dante identifies personally in a very unusual manner with the sinners of this 𝗶𝗷𝗃. He suggests that he too might fall into the same sin. Second, he makes this acknowledgement exceptionally before giving us his account of the sin here punished. In other words, in this case, the moral of the story precedes the telling of the story itself, or rather, the stories, for 2 are the stories that Dante is about to recount. The story of the ancient, legendary Greek hero Ulysses, and that of a modern condottiero, Guido da Montefeltro, who died actually in 1298, so only 2 years before the setting, the temporal setting of Dante's journey. Thus, even before we read the 2 cantos, we are told that they concern an ethical issue which Dante himself feels deeply involved with. It's an issue that is still very much alive in our time and in our culture. In fact, I think that today it is more relevant than ever. Very briefly, what are we to do with our intelligence? How far can we let it go? Can we let it run its course freely without any consideration for its social and moral consequences? More about this later. The sinners of this 𝗶𝗷𝗃 are traditionally called fraudulent counselors, but this label hardly covers the complex set of issues that they embody. It is an unsatisfactory label that distracts our attention from what I believe inspires Dante. Let's then examine the first of these 2 cantos, Canto 26. Dante and Virgil are standing on the bridge over the 8th 𝗶𝗷𝗃. Under the bridge is a dark and eerie landscape. tongues of fire creeping about by the thousands, like fireflies in a summer's night. A ghostly silence everywhere. Dante is so intent on looking down that he almost falls over. His attention is focused on a double flame, cloven at the top. Virgil explains that it hides and torments Ulysses and Diomedes, two great Homeric heroes. He lists the three deceptions for which they are being punished, including the infamous Trojan horse, of course. However, Dante is still anxious that the cloven flame come and speak to them. When the flame does come, Virgil entreats one of the two burning spirits to tell them where and how he died. And here, the flame of Ulysses begins to toss and murmur, suggesting a great oak tree beaten and shaken about by the winds. Then its tip waves to and fro, and finally, after 20 centuries of silence, the murmur becomes a sound, and the sound a voice. Lo maggior corno della fiamma antica cominciò a crollarsi mormorando pur come quella cui vento affatica. Indi la cima qua e là menando, come fosse la lingua che parlasse, gittò voce di fuori e disse quando. Here, like many other characters in Inferno, Ulysses starts telling something very unusual, the story of his death. Not the story of his life, the story of his death. And this, in a nutshell, is what he says. After leaving the sorceress Circe's near Gaeta, which is on the coast between Rome and Naples, where his companions were transformed into animals and he was kept for over a year, neither affection for his son, nor devotion for his father, nor the love he owed his wife could overcome within him his yearning to know the world and the vices and virtues of man. Né dolcezza di figlio, né la pietà del vecchio padre, né il debito amore lo qual dovea Penelope far lieta, vincer potero dentro a me l'ardore ch'io ebbi a divenir del mondo esperto e dei vizi umani e del valore. Well, instead of sailing eastward to Ithaca, his home island on the Ionian Sea, Dante's Ulysses sets forth on the open sea with one ship and the few men who had survived their 10 years' wanderings from Troy. Together, they sail past all the known landmarks of the Western Mediterranean, Sardinia, the shores of Spain, Morocco, Seville, and Ceuta. By the time they reach the Pillars of Hercules, now Straits of Gibraltar, of course, Ulysses and his companions are old and slow. Nevertheless, Ulysses, captured by the call of the unknown beyond the straits, Ulysses speaks to his companions, urging them onward. O frati, dissi, che per 100 miglia perigli siete giunti all'Occidente, a questa tanto picciola vigilia di nostri sensi che del rimanente non vogliate negar l'esperienza di retro al sol del mondo senza gente. Considerate la vostra senenza, fatti non foste a viver come bruti, ma per seguir virtute e conoscenza. Just because, Ulysses says, just because we have so little time left to live, we should not deny ourselves experience of the unpeopled world beyond where the sun sets. Consider your seed, your origin. You are human beings. You were not made to live like beasts, but to pursue virtue and knowledge. now fired up by his speech, Ulysses and his men sail on, disregarding the warning of the pillars of Hercules. They sailed into the uncharted ocean, always bearing south in what was to be their mad flight, their 𝗨𝗨𝗶𝗴𝗵𝗶. They sail for 5 moons until they come in sight of a huge mountain rising in the middle of the ocean. And as they are cheering the sight of land, a hurricane coming from the mountain strikes the ship, which spins around 3 times, is caught in the whirlpool and plunges into the abyss. As pleased another, Ulysses says, 𝗨𝗶𝗆 𝗁𝗍𝗔𝗲 con tutte l'acque. Alla quarta levar la poppa in suso e la prora ir in giù come altrui piacque. Infinte il mar fu sovra noi richiuso. With this scene of Ulysses and his men drowning in view of safety, the safety of a mysterious land, both the canto and Ulysses' story come to a close. This is briefly, very briefly, the episode of Ulysses in Dante's Inferno. Very simple indeed, at least on the surface. When, however, one considers the canto in some depth, one is faced with multiple questions and problems of interpretation. First, did Dante know Homer? Dante's version of Ulysses' death is absolutely unique in the tradition of Western literature. Homer's Odysseus goes home to Ithaca, to Penelope, to his son, to his father. Homer does not tell the story of how Ulysses dies. In any case, Dante is unlikely to have known the Odyssey, as Greek was unknown in the West until the end of the 14th century. Dante probably had some notions about Ulysses through references he found in the Latin classics and in various summaries of the Homeric poems available in the Middle Ages. But if he did know, why did he change Homer's story? And if he didn't know it, why did he choose to have Ulysses die how and where he does? Doesn't Dante realize that by telling us that Ulysses dies there and then, he makes the story of the Odyssey actually impossible? Second set of questions. What are we to make of Dante's Ulysses? Is he guilty of neglecting his duties as father, son, husband, and king of Ithaca, as many critics maintain? Is his speech to his crew fraudulent? What are the virtue and knowledge he's after? And what is the mountain he sees and fails to reach? How do we explain his shipwrecking? Who is the other who is pleased, apparently, by his disaster? Finally, and above all, what is Ulysses' sin? What is he guilty of? Let me try and deal briefly with this set of questions. First of all, there is a so-called romantic interpretation, which views Dante's Ulysses as the tragic prototype of the untamed explorer, who gives his life for the sake of knowledge and freedom. This interpretation, beautifully articulated in Tennyson's poem in around 1840, is exemplified in Italy by Francesco de Sanctis, who, writing in 1870, views Ulysses as a pyramid planted in the mud of 𝗨𝗶𝗶𝗵𝗶, una piramide del fango di 𝗨𝗶𝗶𝗵𝗶, a forerunner of Columbus and the pioneer of modern science. This is also the view of the most eminent Italian intellectual of the first half of the 20th century, Benedetto Croce, who died in 1952. For him, Ulysses is, yes, guilty of sin, but a sublime sin. And it is, and therefore he is a tragic hero. And this was the standard interpretation in Italy from the 1920s to the 1950s. And you will find it memorably remembered and effective, of course, in Primo Levi's memorial from Auschwitz in the book, If This Is a Man. We'll come to that later. However, this is not the interpretation that prevails today. The interpretation prevailing today, especially in the US, is totally different. And it is based on a rigidly moralistic notion, according to which anything that may seem positive and good in Dante's Inferno can only be a deception, for everything in hell must be by definition, be negative and bad. Accordingly, Canto 26 is viewed as a continuum in which, after listing Ulysses' traditional three deceptions, Dante goes on to fabricate a fourth one in which the hero, with his rhetorical skill, persuades his old companions to sail to his and their own destruction. Rocco Montano in 1956 wrote something that became very popular in the States. Ulysses is, in Dante's mind, the incarnation of a vain and distorted investigation of a search for knowledge that for Dante, as for the whole medieval world, was curiosity, was prostitution of our rational virtue. According to this view, Dante transforms Homer's hero into a figure who squanders his God-given genius in pursuit of useless knowledge. Thus, in this interpretation, Ulysses' last adventure is also his worst deception. And Ulysses himself is a consummate trickster, a cunning deceiver. My friend Robert Hollander is particularly scathing of the heroic interpretation of Ulysses, which he considered naive and wrong. For him, Ulysses is a con artist who has fooled many readers of the comedy, from Lord Tennyson to Primo Levi. The mention of Primo Levi shows that it's not a mere academic issue. For on the basis of such reading, it would be unthinkable for someone like Levi, while a prisoner in Auschwitz, to find in his memory of Dante's Ulysses the glimmer of light and hope that he tells us about in If This Is a Man, in his books, questo è un uomo. Clearly, if he finds Ulysses in Inferno, Dante must be convinced that he is guilty of mortal sin. But what is Ulysses' sin? For me, it is neither his failure to go back to Ithaca, nor his search for knowledge, nor the unlikely deception of his companions, but the unrestrained use of intelligence, as shown both in his famous deceits and in his last tragic adventure. It is this intelligence, this ingenio, that pushes him out of the Mediterranean and towards the mysterious island in the middle of the ocean. Now, this is not any island. In Judeo-Christian imagination, it is the island of the Garden of Eden, the earthly paradise. lost to humankind by Adam and Eve. This is what Ulysses seems to be after, the object of the greatest Judeo-Christian myth. In order to understand this point, it is essential to focus on the differences between Dante's Ulysses and Homer's Odysseus. In other words, on how Dante transforms the traditional Ulysses. Well, Homer's Odysseus displays two contrasted impulses that drive him forward. One is his desire to return home, to Ithaca, his nostalgia for his family, for peace after 10 years spent fighting at Troy and 10 more trying in vain to return home. The other impulse is his yearning to explore and gain knowledge of new lands and unknown, unexpected people. These two impulses push him in opposite directions, keeping him wandering for 10 years all over the Mediterranean. But in the end, the centripetal impulse wins, and the Homeric Ulysses returns home to resume his position as king, husband, father, and son. You see, it's the little island of Ithaca there on the west of Greece and on the east of Kephallonia. A very small island, so small that in fact many critics think that Kephallonia was where Ulysses came from and not Ithaca. Now, what does Dante do with these two impulses that are so fundamental to the Homeric Odysseus? Dante does not know Homer's Odysseus, but he knows, he is aware of the two impulses that I've been briefly describing. And on these modest foundations, he builds something quite different. Something new and absolutely brilliant, I think. He merges one impulse into the other. Ulysses' desire for home, the known and the past, into his yearning for knowledge, the new and the future. In other words, Dante reorientates Homer's Ulysses. Instead of aiming towards Ithaca, Dante's Ulysses aims for a loftier, definitive home, a mondo senza gente, a world, an unpeopled world. A world that he has never seen, but that he longs to explore, and that he intuitively thinks that it must exist. This is now what he longs to reach in his folle volo, this mad flight beyond the pillars of Hercules. Dante's Ulysses discovers within himself what 5 centuries later Baudelaire will call the nostalgie du pays qu'on ignore. A nostalgia for a land that one does not know. A nostalgia for the future. Or if you wish, for some unknown, happy island, earthly paradise. Now, this is not a fanciful invention of mine, but in line with medieval thinking, a destiny which is inscribed in the very name of the Greek hero. According to a well-known medieval etymology, the name Ulysses derives from ollum xenos, which means a stranger to all things. Or as Uguccione da Pisa writes in his dictionary, a dictionary which Dante knew very well, quasi peregrinus omnium, iste designat writes 𝗟𝗶𝗃𝗀𝗀, sapientem qui in hoc mundo conversatur tanquam peregrinus. That is, the word Ulysses denotes the wise man who inhabits this world as a pilgrim, a stranger. And here he adds a famous biblical authority, St. Paul's letter to the Hebrews, and the phrase that synthesizes a fundamental Christian belief. What is for Christians the real human condition on earth? Non enim 𝗗𝗶𝗶 manentem civitatem, sed futuram inquirimus. For here we have no lasting home, but we seek the home which is to come. There you have Dante's brilliant innovation. Dante's Ulysses foresees somehow, without realizing it, of course, the geography of the Christian world. He sails towards the island of earthly paradise, the island destined to become one day the island of purgatory. No wonder that he must be stopped. He cannot be allowed to break through the law of time and reach earthly paradise before Christ reopens its gates. Ulysses comes in sight of the ultimate center, the ultimate home, but he cannot be allowed to know and experience it, and is struck down, is stopped. He dies as he exercises his greatest virtue, the virtue that defines him. Let's go back for a minute to the most thrilling moment of his address to his companions before they sail into the unknown. Considerate la vostra semenza, he says, fatti non foste a vivere come bruti, a perseguir virtute e conoscenza. Now, let's go back to June 1944. Auschwitz, Primo Levi. When Primo Levi remembers and recites this passage in Auschwitz, he's absolutely stunned by it. As if I also, he writes, as if I also was hearing it for the first time, like the blast of a trumpet, like the voice of God, la voce di Dio. For a moment, I forget who I am and where I am. As he translates Dante's verses into French for his inmate Jean, Primo is struck by their extraordinary energy, their overwhelming relevance there and then. Thanks to these words, far from forgetting who he is and where he is, Primo rediscovers within himself the human being he feared dead. For a moment, he rises above the camp and his torturers, asserting his irrepressible humanity. Why? Because here Ulysses defines in a nutshell, I mean, Dante's Ulysses defines in a nutshell what it is to be a human being. And Primo feels that despite all the suffering and humiliation he has been through, that definition still applies to him today. They are indeed extraordinary words, the founding ethos of Western culture, as has been said. The key is in the virtue and knowledge which Ulysses singles out as the values whose pursuit distinguish humans from beasts. What are they? Very simply, virtue means adherence to and search for the good, and knowledge, adherence to and search for the truth. They are the values that Dante's Ulysses merges together when he decides to sail beyond the sunset into the mondo senza gente, searching for an ultimate truth. Only apparently then is Ulysses' journey centrifugal. With his genius, his technology, and the strength of his companions, he comes in view of the civitas futura, the future city, the future home, earthly paradise, the center of the world. But he's not allowed to go any further. He is stopped come 𝗨𝗶𝗃𝗀𝗃, as another world. Now, who is this other? Ulysses does not know. He only knows that it is a power that prevented him from landing on that shore. But here is Dante's genius. When Ulysses' ship crashes against the storm, something truly extraordinary happens. Two different eras, two different ethical orders, and two poetic worlds intersect and clash with one another. The ancient and the modern, the pagan and the Christian, the Homeric and the Dantesque. By attempting to land on earthly paradise before it is reopened by Christ's death, Dante's Ulysses is unknowingly trying to break through the laws of time, to sail upon the waters of the future to a destination that is beyond his time. This is the so human and so necessary and yet unexpected anachronism that Primo Levi discovers in a flash of intuition at Auschwitz, of all places in the world, on that morning of June 1944. With his intelligence, Ulysses seems to intuit that a paradise on earth does exist. And he tries to reach it with the physical strength, with his physical strength and his intellectual power. What he does not know is that it could never be reached without God's grace. St. Thomas Aquinas, a philosopher, writing about the sin of Lucifer, makes a very sobering and indeed terrifying point. The devil, he writes, sinned not by desiring something evil, not by desiring something evil, but rather by desiring something good. That is ultimate beatitude, but not in a fitting manner. That is not in such a way as to attain it by God's grace. So, one can find damnation by looking for something good, be it knowledge, as Adam and Eve did, or power, as did Lucifer. This is Ulysses' case as well. The difference, of course, is that Lucifer knew, whereas Ulysses doesn't. The other difference is that while the world that Lucifer aims to conquer does exist, the world Ulysses is after belongs to the future. However, and this really is the great point of Ulysses' tragedy. However, this is no justification. Ulysses' subjective innocence does not make him less objectively guilty. And this is his tragedy. A pagan and a sinner, Ulysses attempts to reach the mountain directly by means of intelligence and strength alone. However heroic and noble, his attempt is destined to fail. In the end, Ulysses' unrestrained use of intelligence will be self-destructive. However, though guilty and doomed to fail, his attempt is noble, heroic, and consistent with the nature, with his nature and his identity. This is why, with the passing of time, the character of Ulysses has found increased consensus and empathy among Dante's readers. As Western humanism gradually grew more confident and less subject to religious fears and restraints, as culture gradually turned more secular, Dante's readers found in Ulysses an exemplary figure, a predecessor and standard bearer. Ulysses is the greatest example of both the limits of Dante's humanism and the risks of lay humanism. With brilliant intuition, Dante senses that though good, Ulysses' quest is driven by a self-confidence, a humanistic intensity, a belief in reason and human potential, in one word, a secularism that he considers dangerous. And therefore he imagines the tragic ending to which he is convinced that Ulysses is destined. It may seem strange or even paradoxical, but Dante understands that concealed within Ulysses is the mind of one whom Horkheimer and Adorno, in their dialectics of enlightenment, call an illuminist, un illuminista, a free thinker, a modernist. And while being intellectually fascinated by him, he acknowledges that he must be stopped. However, Ulysses' nobility of mind stands out very clearly when you compare his last exploit with that of the modern figure punished in the same ditch of Malebolge, Guido da Montefeltro. After a morally free life, both Ulysses and Guido convert, as it were, searching for some kind of final homeland. Ulysses does it unconsciously as a pagan by inverting his route from Ithaca to the island of earthly paradise. Guido does it as a Christian by becoming a Franciscan and even using the sacraments of the church. In both cases, the goal, eternal happiness, is good and praiseworthy, but the means employed to reach it are, in Ulysses' case, inadequate and anachronistic, and in Guido's profoundly immoral. In both cases, it is the two characters' superior intelligence and paradoxically their search for the good that ruins them. Thus, Ulysses' unbounded reliance on his intelligence is his undoing. His tragedy is meant to be a warning to all humans not to trust their intelligence alone, lest it run where virtue does not guide it. Dante writes, something that is becoming more and more evident in our times, when the vulnerability of modern society to its own inventions is becoming so apparent. Indeed, the moral lesson that Canto focuses on is central not only to the 14th century, but to civilization as a whole. What are we permitted to do with our intelligence? How far may we go with it? Are we allowed to pursue an intellectual quest or scientific research regardless of its consequences? Human cloning, extermination camps, weapons of mass destruction, artificial intelligence, the production and use of materials that irreversibly pollute our environment, the development of information technology that plunges us into epistemic chaos, threatening our individual freedom and our democracy. Where do we stop? Where do we place our own pillars for Hercules? In the last 100 years, we have seen gas being employed not just for domestic and industrial use, but as a cheap and efficient means of eliminating millions of innocent human lives. More recently, we have witnessed passenger planes being crashed into skyscrapers, full of ordinary people going about their daily business. To be sure, these were aberrations. Gas was not invented to poison people, nor aeroplanes to be flown against skyscrapers. But there are many other, more insidious ways in which the seemingly innocent use of materials and devices invented by human ingenuity turn out to have disastrous effects on our world. Think, for example, of the daily use that each one of us, and by now every human being in every corner of our planet, it seems, makes of humble plastic. Yes, I'm sorry to have to speak about humble plastic in this context. A material that in its countless incarnations has become an integral part of our lives, our comfort and convenience, The problem is that as we cannot or know not how to dispose of it with the speed with which we produce it, sooner or later it will end up by submerging and smothering us, polluting most of our land and waters. I hear that the very convenient containers made of polyethylene or polyvinyl chloride, discreetly produced, used, and then abandoned by us in our environment, take anything between 100 and 1,000 years to disintegrate, while other apparently less robust objects, such as plastic bags, need at least 1 millennium to disappear from the face of the earth. There are gigantic islands of garbage floating by now over the oceans. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch is one of them, also known as the Pacific Trash Vortex, which spans waters from the west coast of North America to Japan. Already we know that enormous quantities of microplastic are mixed in with the waters of the beautiful Mediterranean. We know that in many Italian cities, there are times when the air is so polluted that it is dangerous for people to leave home. And we know that global warming melts what used to be called eternal glaciers, affecting sea levels and the normal course of weather conditions. These are some of the outcomes of the use and abuse of human ingenuity and intelligence in our life today. And this is also, if we go back 7 centuries, in the final analysis, the dilemma that inspires Dante's writing of the cantos of Ulysses and Guido da Montefeltro 7 centuries ago. Guido, as well as Ulysses with his 3 famous deceits, demonstrates the immoral and self-serving use of operative or practical intelligence, while Ulysses' last adventure displays the risks of speculative intelligence. Guido is the archetype of the cunning, corrupt, and corruptible individual who prospers until he comes up against divine justice. As for Ulysses, although he's guilty of deceits that consign him forever to hell, he epitomizes the restlessness of human intelligence, its desire to go beyond the limited horizon of our daily experience, seeking answers to our great existential questions and desires. The intelligence that Homeric Odysseus had used to overcome all sorts of practical challenges, Dante's Ulysses turns it towards higher goals. Goals that only in the solitude of the unpeopled world, il mondo senza gente, can be pursued. This Ulysses is not in search of anything evil. In fact, he is, without knowing, in search of the summum bonum, the greatest good. However, while his intelligence is capable of catching a glimpse of a world in which his search would be finally and completely fulfilled, it is not humble enough to realize that such a world will never be accessible without the assistance of divine grace. The notions of Dante's God and his grace are totally alien to Ulysses. Therefore, though in the right direction, his attempt is doomed from the start. And the hero finds death while and because he's looking for life. His lesson to us could not be clearer. Whenever we attempt to push further the limits of our knowledge, we do it under the shadow of Dante's Ulysses, running the same risks as he. I'm just about to finish. 2 minutes and it will be over. Horkheimer and Adorno's book, entitled Dialectics of Enlightenment, begins with these words: enlightenment, understood in the widest sense as the advance of thought, has always aimed at liberating human beings from fear and installing them as masters. Yet the wholly enlightened earth is radiant with triumphant calamity. These lines were written probably in 1942-44 here in the States, with obvious reference to the war that was then raging in Europe and the Pacific. By the time it was published in 1947, the essay took on spine-chilling connotation. After August 1945, the radiation of human intelligence, the oxymoron of the triumphant calamity could only point the finger to the dropping of the first atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The metaphor of enlightenment had become the reality of atomic radiance. Instead of entering into a truly human state, humanity sinks into a new kind of barbarity. This is where progressive thought has driven us. Horkheimer and Adorno seem to imply, echoing unknowingly Dante's insight of 6 centuries earlier. You remember how I began this talk. I grieved then, and now I grieve again as I turn my mind to what I saw, and more than is my custom, I curb my intelligence, lest it run where virtue does not guide it, so that if friendly star or something better still has granted me its favor, I may not deprive myself of it. I curb my intelligence, lest it runs where virtue does not guide it. But then our thought, intelligence, education, knowledge, scientific research, technology, in one word, culture, ultimately responsible for mass destruction, nuclear bombs, contamination of our planet, epistemic chaos, and so on and so forth. They might be, Dante replies. Intelligence can be used for and against anyone, ourselves included. But wait a minute, are we now to put a spoke in the wheel of scientific research? How can we foresee the consequences of the discoveries that human intelligence make? In the last analysis, the tragedy of Dante's Ulysses mirrors the tragic condition of human intelligence itself. Our innate desire for knowledge and fulfillment exposes us to ever more unforeseen and unforeseeable catastrophic risks. This is why Dante warns that we must keep our intelligence under the restraint of moral values if we want it to work for the good of humanity. Such is the challenging balance that the poet asks us to pursue. 7 centuries have gone by since Dante's death. But can we really say today that we have better advice to offer? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pertile, for such an interesting and thought-provoking presentation. We have a great number of questions from our audience, and I'm aware we're running out of time, but I will still try to select and read as many as possible. And I would like to start with a question, rather a comment from Jacqueline, who's saying that Dante's interpretation reminds her of the big concern of the French Renaissance author Rabelais, who insisted that while searching for knowledge, science must never forget ethics. Do you also see this connection?
That's right. I couldn't agree more. It seems to be a translation of what Dante writes in Canto 26. Yes, let's deprive ourselves of it. Let we really ruin ourselves by using it. Yes, we have to be careful.
Certainly. Thank you for your comments, Professor Pertile. And now I would like to move to a question by Victorio, who is saying that in 𝗨𝗶𝗶 notes to the Odyssey, we learned that a few 19th century British writers suggested that while the Iliad could be the work of a male poet, Homer, the Odyssey could actually be viewed as the work of a female narrator, in which Ulysses is no longer the deceitful and cunning fighter, but is more concerned with having survived the war and wanting to return home. Do you have any opinions on these theories, and did they have an influence on your views on Dante's take of Ulysses?
I think this is a very interesting idea that has been about for a while. I don't think that I don't think it needs to concern us in the context of Dante's studies, given that Dante had hardly any idea of the text of the Odyssey, let alone he knew that Homer, was its author, but he had a very vague knowledge of both what Homer was and what his poems were, and he had never read them, he never actually seen it. So, and then there is the fact that Dante's Ulysses is not Homer's Ulysses. It was really a different hero, different figure. It's a different figure. So yes, I mean, I think it is an interesting idea to pursue, but we can't do it here in this context, in the context of Dante studies. Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Pertile. And now I would like to move to a question from 𝗨𝗶𝗆𝗀, who is asking, does time itself have a moral function? Because it seems that time in Dante's Divine Comedy in part determines who can be saved and who cannot, as those who were born before the spread of Christianity obviously cannot enter heaven, in which case it seems that this operation of time is a consequence of the sin of Adam.
This is an extremely interesting question. It is, it has to do with the view of the world that comes with Christianity. My way of looking at Ulysses is based on the notion, the idea that Ulysses sort of intuits the existence of this other world, which is not simply a geographical world, but it is a world of different possibilities, where a permanent home exists that does not exist, of course, in the pagan culture to which he belongs. You see what I mean? So Dante's transforms Ulysses by making him think in a way, or giving him the intuition of something that does not belong to his time. And this is, in my opinion, this is the meaning of that voyage of exploration beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, which is, in a sense, it is a limit in terms of space, but it is also limited in terms of time. So long as Ulysses remains within the Mediterranean, he remains within the world and the scope of Homeric culture, of ancient culture, of pre-Christian culture. When he moves out of it, he does something that seems to interfere with, or tries to conquer, to discover something that must be beyond that strait, it must be beyond the pillars of Hercules. At the end of that ocean, Dante says, beyond the sunset, which is an incredible idea. And we could talk the rest of the evening about the meaning of that. What did he actually mean exactly? So yes, Ulysses represents its kind of two civilizations, two views of the world, two times of the world, two cultures clashing with one another, or attempting to interfere with one another. It's something that is not allowed, not because God doesn't not want it, but because it is impossible. You cannot. He cannot. Dante, Ulysses ship is not the macchina del futuro, you know, the machine that can travel into the future. I don't know how else how to explain this one, this very rich question that is, you know, infinitely, of course, open to all sorts of elaboration. But
thank you so much, Professor Pertile. This was illuminating. And now, if you don't mind, I also would like to ask you a question which actually regards Boccaccio and his Decameron. Boccaccio was almost a contemporary of Dante, and in his work, the Decameron, we see a very different view on intelligence and its uses. Actually, in the Decameron, Boccaccio seems to praise intelligence in all its forms, really, whether it is used with virtue or not. So my question is, how is it possible that there is such a shift in perspective in a relatively short span of years?
Yeah, this is another very excellent question. Let me make 2 points about it. First, as far as the Decameron is concerned, in the Decameron, intelligence is praised and described without any religious, let's say, without any religious restraints. And many of Boccaccio's characters use their intelligence to overcome any weakness they might have, or to conquer objects of their desires, which can be very different from, you know, sexual desire to commercial to political desires, let's say, put it this way. So yes, I mean, that intelligence that you find condemned in 𝗨𝗶𝗶𝗵𝗶𝗶 is alive and well in Boccaccio. Boccaccio writes the Decameron about 30 to 40 years after Dante writes the Divine Comedy. But the very writing of the Divine Comedy, the fact that the existence of Dante's 𝗨𝗶𝗶𝗵𝗶 proves that that intelligence was really widespread and used every day in Dante's time. Not in Boccaccio's time, in Dante's time, in the year 1300. That he was alive and well then. And this is why Dante wants to stop it. The fact that there are so many clever people in 𝗨𝗶𝗶𝗵𝗶 who use their intelligence for their own personal advantage proves that is a use that Dante is worried about. He thinks that it is affecting life in society in a way that is contrary to the well-being of the city, to the well-being of the community. After all, what is 𝗨𝗶𝗶𝗵𝗶 full of? 𝗨𝗶𝗶𝗵𝗶 is full of people who do unto others what they would not want others to do unto them. And this is what we have to remember. And Dante did not think that that was right. He did not think that community life could possibly flourish when there were so many who disrupted that by improper, sinful, if you want, of prevaricating use of intelligence, by using that intelligence to cheat the others, to damage others, to conquer what they wanted, regardless of other people's place in the world and needs and desires. So yes, in the sense, the Divine Comedy is a description of life after death in a way, but at the same time it implies what life is before people, how people live before they reach their destination in the other world. And therefore it is an indictment of how people live now, particularly in Florence. And it's not by chance that, of course, Florence is the focus of Dante's constant condemnation, really, and accusations. It's for him, Florence is the symbol of what is wrong in the contemporary world.
Thank you very much, Professor Pertile, and I'm afraid we are running out of time and we cannot take more questions, but I really would like to express to you my gratitude for spending this afternoon with us and for celebrating Dante with us on such a special year. I also would like to take this opportunity to remind our audience that our celebrations on Dante will go on later this month on March 25th, which is called 𝗵𝗿𝗃𝗿, and it is a sort of nationwide day dedicated to Dante in Italy, because it is on March 25th that traditionally scholars think that Dante started his journey in the afterlife. So on this occasion, each and every institute in North America will have a program about Dante. It will be a sort of day-long marathon, so please stay connected with us, follow us on our websites and social medias to learn more about our upcoming activities. Professor Pertile, again, grazie mille, è stato un onore e un piacere averla qui con noi oggi. Thank you everyone for connecting with us today.
Good evening, buonasera a tutti.
Arrivederci.